Good morning, everyone. This morning's lecture is called Eternally Fresh. It's kind of a summary of some things that I've been studying for a number of years and really trying to figure out very much like a puzzle. I've spent a long time trying to understand what this notion of realization could be, this idea of something that is an effect with no cause, something that all of the great sages say is obvious and in plain sight, that they call it a realization. It's not a discovery. It's not an accomplishment. Not something that is going to be done. It is. It always is. And yet here we are, completely in a state of not seeing or not understanding what we are seeing. When Vivekananda says that mysterious verse, "Stop seeking God and see Him," it always puzzles me. I can intellectually, change doors into God and people into God, but there's no seeing to it. There's no obviousness to it. It seems as if that's what I'm superimposing on reality. And yet we're told that actually the view of the world that we experience is what we are imposing and disguising God as. So I've dug through quite a few different traditions from several different periods of time throughout history to try and grab an understanding or to have a clue tickle the right place of the mind to understand or to get a grasp of what we're trying to see. I'm going to start with Saint Augustine. He's one of the early church fathers for the Christian church. And I'm starting with him more because it's surprising to start with him when we're talking about something non-dual in nature or are pointing at Advaita Vedanta. But I'm reading a fascinating book called The Doctrine of Non-Dual Existence and Christianity. And this book is proposing quite convincingly that non-dualism has always been the main tenet or teaching of Jesus and of Christianity. And so, curiously, delving into that notion, I thought I'd start with St. Augustine, since he's the one that kind of is responsible for the general way that Christianity is taught and doctrinized and dogmatized these days. So he's just doing some thinking, some ruminating on truth. And he says, we may say this year, but what do we have of this year outside of the present day? For of this year, the days gone by are already past, and the days to come are not yet here. We are in a given day, and so we say this year. Say rather today, if you would speak of something present. But if you say today, I would say once again, observe that the first hours of the day are past, and the hours to come are not yet here. Correct that also and say, at this very hour, already past, and the moments to come are not here. In this very moment, do you say? But what moment? While you express these syllables, if you enunciate two, the second does not sound until the first is already past. This very syllable, finally, if it has two letters, the one letter does not sound until the other has gone. What do you have, therefore, of these years? And it is quite a meditation because it's factual. You cannot find the moment in which you exist. You cannot define this moment. If you're going to use time to measure it, it is impossible. If time exists and if time is real, as it were, this moment cannot exist. You cannot slice it or catch it in a fine enough state to say this is the present moment before it becomes past, before it becomes a samskara, before it becomes merely something you may or may not remember. So he goes on, he says, well, certainly it's legitimate and even necessary to analyze, to take apart and distinguish these things, but on a condition of not being duped, not being fooled, he says. And he gives us a very important instruction here on how to think about these things, or what apparatuses or tools to use to think about these things, so that we're not fooled, so that we're not led into a misunderstanding. He says, on the condition of not being duped and always ensuring that the intelligence, the faculty of being, which I found interesting. I haven't really seen that described as a faculty before, as a tool for using in our thinking. But he's saying that we always have to make sure that our intelligence and this faculty of being, and not reason alone, which knows only relationships, does not lose contact with the unity of the real. You see, so there's some things that we have to hold on to, that we have to frame this big picture in order to think about it properly. One, we have to understand that the mind alone in using reasoning is not going to reveal this mystery to us, reveal the secret to us, because the mind knows only relationships. And we've talked about that ad infinitum. The fact that the mind needs everything that it can conceive of to have three components, right? The subject, object, and the relationship between the two. And that the mind is always just doing two things. It's finding distinctions, separating things out into categories, and drawing relationships between those categories. That those are the only two functions of mind. So if we're talking about something that's eternal and something that is a unity, one without a second, the mind is not going to be able to hold that. So we have another faculty that he mentioned, the faculty of being, the presence, the practice of presence, which we talked about with Brother Lawrence and his practice of the presence of God. But there's a depth to that practice, far beyond just walking around with the idea of God in your mind, or far, far beyond just having an ongoing conversation with the beloved. There's much more intimacy pointed at in that relationship and in that practice. He says that it is clear that this is not a matter of reflection on the brevity of life. So he's not talking just something, talking about, oh, how short life is, do what you can. It's not that approach. He says there's something more here. Life is neither long nor brief. Neither long nor brief. And what's he saying there? He's pointing at the idea that even if you live 700 years, for example, on that last day, you're going to feel like your life is short. So he's saying that in a relative world with a relative existence, borrowing time and stretching it over everything, there is no such thing as an actual long or an actual short in a relative world. And why does he say that? I taste only one moment at a time in my life, regardless of whether it's 700 years or 2 days. I can only live one moment at a time. My life is this present moment. From this arises the sentiment we sometimes experience, however little we pause to observe ourselves and our ambience, of beginning to exist now, of being for the first time, and at the same time, strangely, of never having been born. Now he draws all of that out of a meditation on the now, on being, on the nature of time, on the nature of the present moment. He's touched some of the deepest Vedantic truths, that you have never been born, and that you can actually get a notion of that idea through this meditation, through this idea of this moment alone is your life, is your being, is your existence, that there is nothing else. There's an interesting Sufi mystic and great master. His name I'm going to try and pronounce. I apologize for my failure already. Muhyiddin Ibn Al, a great spiritual Sufi master. He says, man does not realize that he is not, and that he is anew with each breath. It is a question of the divine exhalation which dilates the worlds from their state of non-manifestation. And if I say anew, I do not suppose any temporal interval, but a purely logical succession. In the renewal of creation at each breath, the instant of annihilation coincides with the instant of manifestation of a like creation. Well, let's unpack that. There's some beautiful and interesting things that he's betraying to us in there. First of all, this notion that in actuality, we as an individual, as a personality, as an ego, we don't have a basis from which to argue our existence. He's saying that from moment to moment, the world is destroyed and created anew. That there is no linear relationship between one moment and the next. And he's suggesting here, he says, that if I say anew, I do not suppose any temporal interval. He's saying he's not talking about time. He's not giving time an absolute existence. He's saying that this string of existence that we experience as an ego self, he says that this exists only as a logical succession in the mind. And very interestingly, Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj makes that same argument. He says that there is only the now. There is no past and there is no future. We again have talked about that many times, and yet we're still living the same way. So we're talking about it again to try and grab this fundamental truth, to try and understand something that we cannot easily, seemingly, see. He's saying that this existence of the personality of the ego self is purely a logical construct to explain your experience of being from moment to moment, which is seen only in the mind. This idea of time, this idea of space, this idea of causation exists in mind alone, right? And just as a reminder, because it's an important point and one that I use every day, is this idea that the past, your idea of past, it's only conceptual. You cannot go to the past, you cannot show the past. It doesn't have an existence. What the past is your attachments, the things that you wanted to share your immortality with, as a way of speaking, that you have taken those things and put them in your mind to hold on to them. And they create a lens on your present, which creates a sense of lack because your attachments don't exist in the present. And that sense of lack gives rise to desire. And desire gives rise to your idea of future. So he's framing that same idea. We've talked about that at length in other lectures, so I won't spend too much time in there. But to know that this feel of the flow of time, this feel of an existence within a field of time that has a past and a present and a future, is purely a mental state, that it is not as it is. And that we can see that when we try and identify this moment, when we try and use time to find the moment. And we see that it's impossible for the two to be coexistent, as it were. Our life is no longer long or short. That if we take in this experience of being, however little we pause to observe ourselves and our ambiance, now that's an interesting idea. When he's looking at the self here and looking at this picture, he's not just talking about just an individual personality or being. He's saying, and your ambiance. And he's drawing into that awareness of awareness, which is the small place in space that we actually exist. God is the awareness, the pure awareness, and the devotee is the awareness of awareness. So Sri Ramana Maharshi talks in those terms. I heard it from the first time in one of his readings. This idea that there is God, which is that pure awareness, unchanging, the absolute. Now, why is it important that we call God the unchanging absolute? Because within a relative world, nothing can exist without there being an absolute of some kind somewhere. The whole thing collapses, right? You can't be far from something unless you have something that you're measuring from, a perspective that you're measuring to. You always need two objects in order to measure anything in the relative world. You can't be happy without measuring it according to sadness. You can't be old without measuring it to youth. You can't be tall without measuring or having a definition of short. You can't be big without identifying a measurement for small. And so this notion that in a relative world, nothing can actually exist unless God, the absolute, exists. It seems like a philosophical point, but with very little amount of thinking, you can see the truth of it. That without something that's unchanging and absolute, a relative world could not exist. It could not exist. So this idea that Muhyiddin is talking about, this idea that the world is recreated every moment, and that it's done by the breath of God into you, giving you your existence, a beautiful idea. He says, insofar as man is a possibility of manifestation, but does not see what manifests him, he is pure absence or non-existence. So see, in that sense where we're disconnected from that sense of the moment, that sense of the I am, of God's presence, he says that we're non-existent. We can't actually come up with a way of explaining how we are in the moment if we take only the manifestation, if we take only the material. He says that it's very clear that we can't actually exist in that. He says, on the other hand, insofar as he receives his being from the perpetual irradiation of the essence, he is. And so, what's he saying there? He's saying there very much what comes up in Genesis, that it's God is the I am, that our very existence is the presence of God within us, that God is that which breathes into us. Like each inhalation, I really like this idea because actually in Genesis, in the Christian Bible and the Jewish scriptures, Genesis chapter 2 and verse 7, it says, the Lord then formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. And I really loved this idea of suddenly kind of taking these two philosophies and putting them arm in arm and letting them inform each other instead of seeing them as separate. You take this notion from the Vedantists, from the Gyanis, that this world is created anew every moment, that it doesn't have a linear existence at all, that the point of manifestation and the point of destruction are at the same point. It's continually being remade, and our existence in it as an individual is God continually, with every inhalation that you take, seeing that as God breathing into your nostrils and giving you your awareness, giving you your existence for this creation in this moment. And what a beautiful intimacy that betrays or that talks about, and what an interesting notion that you can actually break down and, in a way, become aware of the presence of God by the fact that He's giving you your breath, which would be an interesting take on the idea of following the breath for calming the mind as a means of coming into the moment, as a means of garnishing some clarity. So this beautiful notion that this very moment is all that there is. It's all of your life. It is the only life you will ever have, and that you are born anew in this moment. It gives you a new perspective on isness and on your experience of life. In Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, the writer there, he says, our original mind includes everything within itself. You see, this moment contains all of the past and all of the future. So that it's a summary of the past, and it contains all the material from which the future is created itself. So the moment, this full moment, is a moment of fullness, and he's talking about the original mind. That pure mind, according to Ramakrishna, and Brahman or God are one and the same. So pure mind and God are the same. This moment and God are the same, and your awareness of it is God's gift to you as your awareness of awareness, your being, your sense of yourself, which does not have an independent existence from the absolute, from God. So you see how intimate this dance with the beloved really is. I'm mixing a lot of the ideas of jnana and the ideas of bhakti to come up with these notions, but they are the same dance. They are the same dance, just from a different perspective in each one. It is always rich and sufficient within itself. You should not lose your self sufficient state of mind. You should never forget that you have all that you need in the present moment, that everything required for you is given to you for your realization in the present moment. That we do not need to think about things that have to be acquired in the future or things that have to be pulled from a past in order to find that peace of mind, in order to find our realization or our understanding, in order for us to touch the real richness of life and this experience of being. He says it's very important to know that you are self sufficient. You do not need anything outside of yourself for this bliss, for this full and meaningful life, this existence. This does not mean a closed mind, but actually an empty mind and a ready mind. Now, this has got some interesting perspectives coming here. If your mind is empty, it is always ready for everything. It is open to everything. In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. This is where I grabbed the title for today from. This notion that the empty mind, not a mind that doesn't know anything, but a mind that is infinitely aware of everything simultaneously. This creation, sustenance, and destruction going on moment to moment, being aware of this presence of the divine, being aware of this eternity that's actually pointed at in this present moment, that the mind is the moment. The mind is, the still mind is pure being, pure awareness, without any idea of past or future, without any idea of cause and effect, and really, honestly, the removal of karma. That this mind is separate and apart from the actual moment. Remember, it is God's breath into us that gives us this awareness of awareness, which is mind. It's God's breath moment to moment that sustains our continuity, our being. That's all borrowed from the divine, which is outside. And so getting there becomes an interesting feature. How do we escape this idea of cause and effect? How do we escape our own karma? How do we break out of this cycle of samsara that continues to tell us that there is a past and there is a present and there is a future, and the past determines this present and this present determines your future? How do we break out of that kind of thinking? Vivekananda gives an interesting clue here. He says, no man becomes purer and purer. Okay, so it's not a process of cleaning something up, interestingly. It is a matter of greater manifestation. So, what we are trying to do, that self, that isness, that divine spark, that essence that our Sufi mystic spoke of, that God, as it were, that is within us, it's a matter of continually removing this idea of self that we have, this idea of an individual personality. It's a matter of continually setting it aside and letting what is be. That we stop being what we define ourselves to be. We stop being what we think we are. We stop doing what we think we should be doing. And we allow something deeper within us to manifest freely and clearly in the particular moment. So he goes on to say, he says, no man becomes pure and pure. It is a matter of greater manifestation. The veil drops away, and the native purity of the soul begins to manifest itself. So God, that divinity within you, begins to manifest when you shut the ego up, when you still the mind, when you empty it of its wrong ideation, of its wrong thinking. What happens? It's not that you become dull and empty and like an inert piece of wood. Not at all. What happens is your nature begins to manifest, this nature of pure love, this nature of universal love, without preference, without aversion, begins to manifest in you because it's what you are. It's what your notion, what your real self is. All of your faults that you hold on to and feel bad about, they are not you. They are your ego self. They are that self of wrong ideation. And so you really can just discard them, abandon them. I had a little vlog earlier in this week where the writer was telling us just abandon mind. Let it go. Don't feel like your mood is something that you have to fix. Don't feel like your sadness is something that you have to fix. Don't feel like your anxiety is something that you have to fix. He's saying abandon the idea of your mind defining you always. Abandon that idea and let being happen spontaneously in the moment without trying to capture it in mind, without trying to set limitations and definitions on yourself. So he says everything is ours already. That falls directly in line with the Buddhist idea that our practice is not about realizing God. A practice is about knowing that we are realized, that there is nothing to change. that the moment is perfect as it is, and isness is spontaneous and perfect at all times. So completely unidentified. And he's saying here, everything is ours already. Infinite purity is yours already. All right, so Vivekananda is telling you that. So why are you looking for more? Infinite freedom is yours. What is freedom? Freedom is that absence of desire, where you're no longer having to serve a mind that wants things and demands them from you. You're no longer having to serve a body that wants things and demands them from you. We often can make that confusion that our freedom is to do whatever we want, but there is no need in the moment. There is no want in your nature. So you are actually beholding yourself to a mind and to a body. That's where you're borrowing your wants and your desires from. And from that wrong identity, from that mistake, comes a life of need, a life of constant hunger, that we're always, having to plan the next vacation even before the current vacation is over to find satisfaction, because there's no there. And as much as you try to fulfill an idea of yourself that is non-existent in the moment as such, as the way that you understand it, you are caught in eternal hunger. You're caught in a cycle that doesn't end. And so, in a conversation with Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj, a questioner says to him, "Well, what about cause and effect? I mean, come on. Our science, everything is based on cause and effect. How can you suddenly say that they don't exist or that they do?" He says, "Don't they? Of course they must." And Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj says, "Each moment contains the whole of the past and creates the whole of the future." So he makes that same statement that we just heard from our Sufi friend above. And so the questioner jumps on it. He says, "Well, then you're saying that past and future do exist." And Maharaj says, "In the mind only." Right? In the mind only. So if you're looking at a place and seeing past and future, then you are looking through a mind. You're not seeing an isness that precedes the mind. You're still letting the mind tell you the way things are, instead of your ambiance, instead of this faculty of being, which is why I found that so interesting that Augustine was pointing to that notion. This faculty of being that gives us an awareness of our ambiance, of this titillating experience that we often associate with a body and a mind. He says it exists in mind only, past and future. Time is in the mind. Space is in the mind. The law of cause and effect is also just a way of thinking. All right. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of not having an empty mind. It's a way of thinking, of filling it with an idea, and using that idea then to define and to lay out the nature of everything else that you're looking at. And that's the mistake that we've made. We've gone to the mind for our information on what we are and who we are and how we are. He says, in reality, all is here and now, and all is one. Multiplicity and diversity are in the mind only. All right, so this truth that everybody's pointing at here apparently exists outside of this mind, or before this mind, as it were, or with this mind in a state in which the mind is pure, the mind is empty, the mind is uh, ready for everything and available for everything, as the Buddhists were saying. So it's that mind without a ripple in it. So it's not a mind that's a thinking mind, an analyzing mind, a cognating mind. It's actually using your mind as an organ of reception and not an organ of action. It's using your mind as the sensory organ to feel the presence of the divine, as it were, to set the mind up as a big satellite dish and turning it inward toward that source of manifestation that we're unaware of, that source of our being that carries us from moment to moment and allows us to think in a linear term. But to know that there's something deeper. So the mind becomes a sense organ and not an organ of action in that way. He says, once you are inwardly integrated, this is Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj, outer knowledge comes to you spontaneously. Right? So in the non-thinking mind, the non-active mind, the empty mind, All that is necessary in the moment comes to you spontaneously. He says, knowledge comes to you spontaneously. At every moment of your life, you know what you need to know. It's all provided. The moment is perfect in and of itself. That's one of the corollaries of it. That obviously, if that's true, then everything you need for the moment is provided in the moment. In the ocean of the universal mind, all knowledge is contained. It is yours on demand. Most of it you may never need to know, but it is yours all the same. So it's this notion that the quiet mind is the knowing mind, that all knowledge is a manifestation. It's not something we put into mind, it's something that we become aware of in the mind already, as it were. That all learning, according to Vivekananda, is that. It's not putting facts from outside to the inside. It's about quieting the mind so that that truth can arise within it. And we have experiences of that, and the ways that we talk about science and the ways that discoveries are made sort of point to that notion also. These epiphanies, these moments of insight, these times, I'm thinking of the famous mathematician, in his description of how he knew this math, that he watched it happen, he saw it happen. A very interesting notion that all of this infinity truly does exist within us and is available within us if we stop believing in our limitations, if we stop living on the notion of what the mind tells us is real and what the mind describes to us as ourself. He says, as with knowledge, so it is with power. So knowledge and power, your ability to be and do in the moment, as it were, are fully available to you, fully free, self-contained as an experience of being. That's that part of Sat Chit Ananda, that is the gift of the divine to you with each breath into you that sustains you, that God gives to you. He says, whatever you feel needs to be done happens unfailingly. Ramakrishna describes this. Remember when he wanted to build that fence around the Panchavati and suddenly all of the materials necessary washed up on the beach? So if you are in a place of still mind, of empty mind, you and the divine will, as it were, if I can violate some ideas of Advaita there, that you and the divine will are one. So it's not a matter of God's will and your will. At that point, at the point of still mind, that's the absolute surrender that we're talking about in our relationship with this divinity. That at that moment, there's one will, there's one happening, there's one isness, and they are the same. And that's true even now in your mind. We part of our ego world that we've created, the problem with the ego world is we've set up a fence where we say God exists up until this fence, and from this fence to me is mine. This is my space right here. I created. And when I think of God, necessarily, I think of him outside of that space, outside of the me that I've defined, this wall that we've put around ourselves. But it's this wall that we put around ourselves that prevents us from accessing this infinite knowledge, this infinite energy and power, and this infinite knowing of being, where everything is perfect as it is. So we have to tear down that wall. And so in Zen mind, beginner's mind, Suzuki gives us some indications on how to go about this. He says, we say concentration, but to concentrate your mind on something is not the true purpose of Zen. So he says it's not concentration for concentration's sake. We're going at something different with the idea of concentration. He says the true purpose is to see things as they are. All right, so a concentrated mind, a still mind, a one-pointed mind, is able to see things as they are without all of that other wrong ideation coming in and defining it for you, giving it its place in karma, in this string of past, present, and future. So you get a vision of clarity if you stay still and in the moment and experience only the moment and borrow by letting go of your ego ideation of yourself as separate and apart from everything, that in that moment, the universe explains the moment to you. The universe gives you everything to exist perfectly, as it were, in that moment. He says the true purpose is to see things as they are, to observe things as they are, and to let everything go as it goes. Zen practice is to open up our small mind. So concentrating is just an aid to help you realize big mind. or the mind that is everything, the still mind, the mind that is this organ of reception, as it were. It's a mirror. It's a mirror that you are looking at divinity in. So your mind, which has all this ripple and all this noise and all this ideas of me and mine that keep it flickering and moving, is actually just a mirror. It's a liquid mirror, so it can have a state of disturbance where you can't see the face of God. Instead, you see multiplicity, right? Just like that famous example of the moon reflected in the water, that if the water is stirred, you don't see a moon. You see lots, thousands of shards of light with no real form or definition, but they're diversity and individual and different. But in the still water, you see the moon as a whole. Well, see, there's a you that is before mind, and it's facing mind, as it were. This is all metaphor, of course. And that mind that you are looking at all of the time, usually picking out thoughts and waves from that you're interested in, that mind in its still form is a perfect mirror. And if you can look at that perfect mirror, you will see yourself. And you'll know your nature. You'll know the secret of who it is that's manifesting as you in the present moment. That self, which is providing this infinite power, providing this infinite knowledge, and who is the root that makes every moment perfect, becomes aware to us, becomes clear. He says, when you try to stop your thinking, it means that you're bothered by it. Okay, so he's saying, so our first idea, right? When we're sitting there, we're thinking, oh, well, still mind and a clear mind, I can see the divine. Then I have to go about stilling the mind. That's what I have to do. He says, well, when you try to stop thinking, it's because you're bothered by it. All right, to be bothered, that betrays the existence of ego. You're relying on an ego self, because only egos can be bothered. That's always a good thing to remember. You and your true self cannot be bothered. You can't be agitated. You can't be disturbed. That's your nature. That's part of living in that pure realm, that knowledge of the self that is everything. Yourself can't bother yourself. So he's saying that here we can't go and try and stop our thinking, because that's still egoistic thinking. We're still seeing ourselves as separate from it all, and then having to go in as an agent of action and change something. He's saying it's not like that. He says, when you try to stop your thinking, it means you're bothered by it. Do not be bothered by anything. All right. So this is an openness. Being bothered or feeling like you need to make a change is a closedness. That's a restriction. And through that restriction comes delusion. We can't see the oneness. And remember that Augustine and his writers earlier on told us that was one of the things we have to hold in mind when we are analyzing or ruminating on the nature of God or the nature of time or the nature of being. He says, never forget this overlying unity of all things, this oneness. That's what will lead you in the right way and help you to keep elbowing this idea of an ego self out of the way, which in itself is a contradictory way of thinking. But that's the Buddhist koan. It gives you those two things that can't fit in the mind, a statement that can't be analyzed, in hopes that you'll blow that circuit and find something supra mind, something outside of mind. So he says, when you try to stop your thinking, it means you're bothered. Don't be bothered by anything. It appears as if something comes from outside your mind, but actually it is only the waves of your mind. And if you are not bothered by the waves, gradually they will become calmer and calmer. Sri Nisargadatta also talks about this in slightly a different way. He says that your mind, the waves of your mind, will become calm as you lose interest in them. Which is very important, because quite often we talk about our lack of, quote, our lack of ability to meditate or our lack of ability to do anything as if we're a victim to a mind, or as if we're a victim to our karma, as if we just can't help it. Oh, I can't meditate. What to do? What to do? Alas, I'm lost. It's not the notion. Your mind is active because you enjoy it. Your mind is wandering because you want it to. That the things that come up in the mind would just come and pass if you weren't interested. They would just come and go, like many thoughts do in the day that we're not interested in. But those ones that we have an attachment to, right? Those ones that kind of tickle one of our memories, one of our experiences, one of our favorites, or one of our aversions. Those things that go through the mind that tickle one of those, they get our attention because of that attachment. And we're interested in them. Ooh, hey, I like that one. Or, ooh, I don't like that one, right? But it's you being interested. It's very important that we come to a point of understanding that our delusion is our desire, that we want to be deluded. We often talk in terms of like, oh, I wish I was enlightened, or I want to be enlightened, or I want to see God, I want to know God, which is conscious mind speaking, the top 1 inch of our existence. So there's a certain truth to it. But Holy Mother tells us that if that was true, if you wanted your realization, you would have it. She says you can have your realization this very moment if you want it. And so it's important to know that the fact that we're not realized is not that we're a victim to some outside influence, to a God that doesn't want us to be realized, or to something along those lines. It's because we enjoy our personality. We enjoy our body. We enjoy our existence. And when the mind is wandering in the shrine, it's because we're enjoying that wandering. And so it's very important that we distinguish and discern these things, to work them out, to see that the desire that keeps us interested in all of this change is because of misunderstanding of who we are. And it's through that knowledge that we can begin to be uninterested in all of the change and all of the dancing and changing colors and flickers of the mind and all the sensations of the body. And why? Because they're bad? No, but because they're temporal. You won't always have a body to enjoy. Then what? You won't always have a mind to enjoy. Then what? So we are an eternal being, for the moment seemingly, in a temporal cart, vehicle, that's going to go away. And so life is about knowing our nature that is beyond that. Beyond what? Beyond the idea of a past and a future, which is just what? This particular moment. This moment is the eternity that we're going to enjoy forever, right? And to come to know its perfection is very important if you're going to be in it forever. To know it to be all powerful and to have everything that you've ever needed or wanted or desired or had to have, this moment contains it. It's important to know that, because this is the moment that you will always exist in. It will never change. It is always the same. And it goes through time invisibly. We attach time to it, but it itself is that invisible thread that supports your sense of I through a changing body and through a changing mind. Right? When you talk about when you were 5 years old, the I that you're using to describe your 5-year-old I is the same I you're using to describe your 50-year-old I. And how can that be? Because your body and your mind both are utterly different between those two time points. So, what is this unchanging sense of self? It is the moment, it is the now, it is the breath of God which carries you from one moment to the next. It is your existence, that Sat Chit Ananda. And of course, the gospel, Ramakrishna gives us some very, very encouraging news. He says, and God can be seen. This can be seen. He can be seen through the pure mind and the pure intelligence. That's this empty mind. That's this undefined self that exists in the spontaneity of manifesting in the moment. Manifesting isness, your nature, Satchit Ananda. He can be seen through the pure mind and the pure intelligence. Through attachment to woman and gold, to lust and greed, the mind becomes impure. Those ideas of limitation. What he's talking about when he says lust and greed is a sense of lack. Lust and greed is just a hunger. It's not a thing in and of itself. When you're chasing after lust, what are you chasing after? There's nothing there. It's a notion. It's a notion of needing something for fulfillment, for happiness, for distraction, to allow, some idea of happiness. So lust and greed are not things in themselves. They don't have any existence. They're a hunger, and you chase that hunger, and that hunger only gives you more hunger as you imagine yourself finding it. It goes on, and the scriptures are just trying to save you from jumping on that treadmill and exhausting yourself. saying, look, these are the things that are disturbing your mind. These are the things that you want and desire that are preventing you from having a still mind. You're not a victim. You are actively making these decisions and these choices. Become aware of that, then inform yourself of the nature of the things that are causing this trouble and abandon them, right? Let them go because there's nothing there. Nisargadatta says, time is endless, although limited. Eternity is in the split moment of the now. We miss it because the mind is ever shuttling between the past and the future. It will not stop to focus on the now. It can be done with comparative ease if interest is aroused. So paying attention to being, it's a practice for us. A practice not because it's hard to do, but because we're so used to bouncing between past and future, right? We've talked about that in the past also. This idea, your past, right, is your attachments. So you're constantly thinking about your attachments. Oh, I love that time in Bali. Oh, I remember my first love. Oh, I remember the joy of being in school. Oh, I wish I could sleep in on Saturdays. All of these attachments that we have. And then all of our desires that they create. Attachments create desire by making the present look empty, making the present look like it doesn't contain everything that is necessary. So that's the reason we have to be unattached. If we get rid of attachments, we get rid of our sense of lack. We get rid of our sense of needing something for perfection. We get rid of the idea that something needs to be added to us in order for us to be complete. And when we do that, desire stops of its own accord because desires grow directly out of attachments, right? And attachments to your past, desire is your future, right? Because when you sense the moment needs something, you have to invent a future in order to bring that thing that it lacks into the present. So that's where your future is coming from. So you see how you're chasing your own tail. You're creating attachments, holding them in your mind, preventing you from seeing how wonderful the moment is, how full and delightful it is as it is. And it's making you chase things that don't exist, chase things that are hunger in and of themselves. And that loop is where you're living, bouncing back and forth between attachment and desire all the time, missing the fact that you're in the middle of the Garden of Eden, as it were, missing the fact that all of this is enough. He says, how does this personality come into being then? Which is interesting. How did we get here? He says, by memory. By identifying the present with the past and then projecting it into the future. Think of yourself as momentary, without a past and a future, and your personality dissolves. The ego requires this delusion of a past and a future in order to maintain itself, its non-existent self. And that's what Augustine and the early Christian writers were saying earlier when they were saying, well, actually, it was our Sufi mystic who was saying that man is unaware of the fact that as an ego self, he doesn't exist, that his existence itself comes from the breath of the divine, from God. So this is what he's saying here. He's saying that our personality comes in by memory. It's only because when we make a decision, we drag in our whole memory in order to make that decision because we're identified with it. This is who I am. This is how I act. This is how I react. This is what I do in this situation. This is what I say. And it's interesting when you start to understand that your personality is not who you are, that your personality is just sort of a mechanical response to a broken view of history. It becomes less desirable, becomes less something you really want to identify with and hold on to. That it's an invention every moment, right? It's an invention that you create in every moment for yourself based on the conditions of body and mind in relation to memory, in relationship to a past. So this is where you come. And all you have to do is live in the present moment itself, and personality dissolves. This ego, which is blocking your understanding of the divine, goes away. This mind, which is rippling, calms and allows you to be in your perfection. Ramakrishna says the mind is everything. It is like a white cloth just returned from the laundry. It will take any color that you dye it with. Knowledge is of the mind, and ignorance is also of the mind. When you say that a certain person has become impure, you mean that impurity has colored his mind. Yeah, because we are that infinite moment, this pure present of being, and that all of the things that we identify with are within mind. This whole universe exists only in your mind. Everything, whether it's an experience or a memory or a desire or anything coming in through the senses, all of it is only a thought. It does not have any existence independent from you. Just as God is breathing your existence from moment to moment into you, you are breathing the existence of this external world and this ideation into its existence. Moment to moment, you are keeping it alive in your mind, and you perceive it as coming from outside, but there is no outside. There is no provable outside to the mind. Everything is thought alone. He says, once a devotee was overwhelmed with ecstasy at the sight of a babla tree. The idea flashed in his mind that the handle of the axe used in the garden of the temple of Radha Krishna was made from the wood of the babla tree. Another devotee had such devotion for his guru that he would be overwhelmed with divine feeling at the sight of his guru's neighbors. Krishna consciousness would be kindled in Radha's mind at the sight of a cloud, a blue dress, or a painting of Krishna. She would become restless and cry like a mad person, Krishna, where are you? So this notion that one of the ways that we can begin to detach from this mind is to associate the things that we see in the mind with the ever-present perfect self, the being, God, our closest companion, the companion who enables all of our favorite things and who hides behind the twinkling of all of our favorite things, you know, to become aware and to tie our wrong ideation to a right idea, little by little, so that God, this moment, we drag ourselves back into the present. We're not ruminating things of past and future. We are being present, perfectly present, and aware of love, aware of intelligence, aware of our being, the faculty of existence, as it were, and that notion of unity, that notion of oneness. Swami Vivekananda says, if you dare declare that you are free, now why would he say that? If you would dare declare that you are free, because what are you doing when you declare that you are free? You're surrendering utterly, in one sense, one way of talking about it. The other sense of talking about it is renunciation, that to be free of desire is to renounce everything. The only way to have freedom is to have no desire. So desire has to be abandoned. And he's daring you to do it. He's daring you. This is one of the most terrifying things you will ever do. If you dare to be free, free you are this moment. All right? So now we have that from Holy Mother, right? Who we see as an incarnation of God as Mother. So that's a pretty good source of information. And here we're hearing it directly from Vivekananda, a man of steady wisdom, saying, if you dare to declare that you are free, you are this moment. If you can renounce all, if you can let go of all desire, all sense of imperfection. So instead of seeing, when someone says renounce your desire, instead of seeing colored bicycles and big stereos and swimming pools and big vacations and thinking, oh, I can't possibly give that up, understand what all of those things are in their nature. They are only hunger. Because once you get that red bicycle and it wears out, you need another one. Once you get that vacation, how many times have you been on vacation when you're already planning next year's vacation? You see, when you start to understand the nature of ego, the nature of this material world, which has no existence in and of itself, it means it cannot feed you. It cannot give you what you are looking for. And Vivekananda is saying, I dare you to admit that. I dare you to absorb that as truth. Because if you can, you are free this very moment. You will experience it as God. If you say that you are bound, bound you will remain. And that's a warning sign. That's a warning that we all need to hear, because all of us see ourselves as bound. How many of us whining devotees, right? We are. It's like, oh, I can't meditate. Oh, I'm so bound. Oh, I'm so stuck. I'll never get it in this life, maybe in the next life. That's all just thinking. You're using your memory to define who you are, and you're holding on to wrong ideation. Your freedom is yours. Take it. The dare is yours. Jump. Be free. Know yourself to be that. And move on, as it were. Experience a new moment that's eternally fresh, eternally new. In this room full of darkness for thousands of years, you come in, and it goes to tell us that bring in the light, and the evil goes in a moment. Build your character, manifest your real nature, the effulgent, the resplendent, the ever pure, and call it up in every one that you see. Know that it's all around you. I wish that every one of us had come to such a state that even in the vilest of human beings, we could see the real self within, and instead of condemning them, say, rise, thou effulgent one. Rise, thou who art always pure. Rise, thou birthless and deathless. Rise, Almighty, and manifest your true nature. These little manifestations do not befit you. You see how if you come to know this about yourself, and if you dare to renounce, and you dare to see the moment as perfect, to let go of all of your desires and all of your wrong ideation about yourself, the world becomes different. Instead of seeing a world of division and strife, Republican and Democrat, conservative and liberal, and all of these notions, and feeling the judgments and the condemnations and the hatred and the anxieties that all of that befalls all of that, you will instead feel an inspiration of goodness and goodwill within for all of yourselves in all of its manifestations. You will know that overarching oneness, and there will be nothing but wishes of goodwill from you. And what a beautiful human being that is. That is a real human being. That is someone who knows who they are, someone who knows what they are. He says, this is the highest prayer that Advaita teaches. This is the highest prayer that unity, one without a second, can possibly teach you. This is the one prayer to remember our true nature, the God who is always within us, thinking of it always as infinite, always as almighty, always as ever good, ever beneficent, ever selfless, bereft of all limitation. This is our one prayer, to remember that, not to achieve it, not to get it, not to earn it, not to create it, to remember it, that it is already created, already true, already existent within you. If you could take your eyes off of the non-existent ego and pull yourself away from the cycles of hunger that this implies, this will be the world you will live in. This will be your understanding of the things as they are. And because nature is selfless, it is strong and it is fearless. For only to selfishness comes fear. He who has nothing to desire for himself, whom does he fear, and who can frighten him? What fear has death for him? What fear has evil for him? So this resolution brings about that fearless state. And without fear, there is no anxiety. So all of our troubles disappear. Now you have a litany of buts in your mind, and it would be good to write them down, because every one of them will be an attachment that you can work on loosening, that you can work on letting go of, so that you can experience this mode of being, this truth of existence. The master says if a pea falls into filth, it grows into a pea plant nonetheless. You're a pea by nature. You're going to grow into the divine no matter what. This is inevitable for you. Do not despair if this seems impossible. It's your very nature. That's the whole point. It's going to germinate in you. It's going to find root in you, and it's going to express, because it's doing it now. It's doing it now perfectly, but not seeing it as it is what makes you keep thinking that it's not perfect. And so that the Ramakrishna says, if a pea falls into filth, it grows into a pea plant nonetheless. And then M says to him, but there aren't still the 8 bonds, right? That's all of us in class. Someone says, you can be perfect right now if you want to be perfect. And then we're like, yeah, but what about? Or yeah, what about? Or what about? Right? We always have a good reason for being the way we are. That's why reason alone cannot take us to God, because reason belongs to the ego. Reason belongs to the ego. Intelligence, knowledge, belongs to the self. Reasoning is a series of thoughts, requires a past, requires a future. It is delusional, and it can take you there. So the master says, a pea falls into filth, it grows into a pea plant nonetheless. M says, but there's still these 8 bonds. And the master says, they are not 8 bonds, but 8 fetters. All right? And he says, but what if they are? So what? These fetters fall off in a moment. Where? Now. This is the moment. These fetters fall off in a moment. How? By the grace of God, by the nature of the universe, by that loving, merciful, ever resilient, ever forgiving, ever encouraging nature of the universe. These fetters fall off. They're not an excuse. They're not a thing holding you here you are in the way that you are. Ramakrishna actually says, so what? Don't even pay attention to them. They fall off in a moment by the grace of the beloved, by the grace of nature, by the very sense of being. That's how he can assuredly say to you, you're going to get there. You're going to have your realization. No one will be left behind. And what a beautiful thing. What a marvelous thing to contemplate in the moment, to know that in this beautiful moment, this radiant moment, that this truth is. He says, they'll be falling off in a moment by the grace of God. Do you know what it is like? Suppose that a room has been kept dark 1,000 years. The moment a man brings light into it, the darkness is gone. Not little by little. Not little by little. Haven't you seen the magician's feat? He takes a string with many knots, ties one end to something, and keeping the other in his hand. Then he shakes the string twice or once, and immediately all the knots are undone. He's saying that's how this is. If you can dare in this moment to say that I am free and I am setting it all down, all of my hunger, I am laying down all of my hunger, then like a magician's wand, you will see things as they are. Because it is the nature of what you are. It is your essence. In his lecture on Vedanta being the future religion, Swami Vivekananda says, we, with 5 senses, look upon this world and find it gross, having color, form, sound, and the like. Suppose that I develop an electric sense. Everything will change. Suppose my senses grow finer. You will all appear changed. If I change, you change. If I go beyond the power of the senses, you will appear as spirit and God. Things are not what they seem. Things are not what they seem. This is the primary motive for why we're interested in spiritual life. Not to ensure our future with a grand imaginary friend in the sky who's going to whisk down and save us from all of our troubles, but by coming to a working and beautiful knowledge of what is, so that this eternal moment unfolds in and of itself to us and reveals to us a beautiful nature, a nature profound and deep, that doesn't change, that is not insecure, that has no need, that lacks nothing. That this is your nature, and in it is your truth. In it is who you are. So when did all of this dream begin? Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj says, it appears to be beginningless, but in fact it is only now, right? So your delusion isn't historical. Your delusion is only in the now. See, immediately we go to our mind and we think, oh, we've got such a history of delusion to undo. We've got this terrible knot of things to undo. But just like Ramakrishna says that the grace of God can undo it in the moment, in this moment, he says here also, understand that all of your delusion isn't because of anything. It's in this moment that you are owning it. It's just your choice to see it incorrectly, to tie everything to an idea of self that floats through an imaginary time. He says, once you have seen that you are dreaming, you will wake up. But you do not see because you want the dream to continue. This is what we were talking about. A day will come when you will long for the ending of the dream with all your heart and mind, and you will be willing to pay any price. The price will be dispassion and detachment, the loss of interest in the dream itself. So that discernment and detachment, discernment and renunciation, this is the key to seeing, because this is what allows the delusion to die. You let go of hunger. And by letting go of hunger, you stop seeking. And when you stop seeking, the ocean calms, the lake becomes still, and the mind finally betrays to you a clear picture of who you have always been, of what you always are. And how does this maturity come about? By keeping your mind clear and clean, by living your life in full awareness of every moment as it happens, by examining and dissolving one's desires and fears as soon as they arise. So it's just being present. Constantly feel the breath of God being breathed into you. Constantly feel the love that exists within you always, that we cherish so much. Know the oneness of all things. Know that there is nothing to hurt you, nothing to punish you, nothing to be afraid of. Hold this always in your mind. And when you get interested in the mind, he says, pay attention, look at the thing and discern. See that it is only hunger and it can only bring you more hunger. That it will only for a moment distract you from that hunger before it doubles that hunger for you. See the nature of the world so that you're not laying down bicycles and homes and apartments, but you're laying down hunger and need. See it for what it is, and it itself will drop away. You will lose interest in it. In a single-minded way, the Zen Buddhist says, the Bodhisattva has only one way. His way is in each moment to express his nature and his sincerity. So that's the way that you live. In each moment, express only your nature, Satchit Ananda, intelligence, love, existence absolute, moment to moment. Measure yourself, stay present in it, let go of the past and future, and express only that nature. And be sincere. Don't split the mind. To be sincere means to don't lie to yourself. Don't lie about the nature of your desires. Don't lie about the nature of your bondage. You are that, and you are free in this moment if you want it.